Can I play devil's advocate on the idea of if we extract away schools and we have an enlightened fun society where the equivalent of the Steven Spielberg thing is playing and the children go along. Now, never mind the mathematics, but Douglas Murray, my favourite pessimist at times, although he's optimistic recently, has talked about how it seems as if the West is running out of steam or running out of enthusiasm for itself, as if the story is coming to an end and winding itself up. So if we move to a place where, for all the evils of school, perhaps they are inculcating at least the students into a version of our traditions and of Western ideals and so on and so forth, because there is no want for enthusiasm in the madrasas. There's no want for enthusiasm of other cultures wanting to spread their ideas to their children. Would this alternative to traditional schooling in the West lead to what Murray is worried about, just the exhaustion of the West?
Well, one problem is, as Naval was saying, that the schools and universities have been taken over by something that's very hostile to our culture. So they're trying to inculcate a rival culture. So I suppose Murray wants to go back to the way the educational system was. And yes, horrible and disgusting though it was, it did successfully transmit some things. Not the things in the lessons. It transmitted a culture. Then after that era, you had the era of, like in Britain anyway, grammar schools and so on, where they tried to make it easy for working class children to get into that culture by having the standard education. And like I was one of those. And then later they closed down all those schools. And then we got to the present state. I doubt that the older model of schools, like the model of schools that existed between, say, 1880 and 1950, I don't think they could survive, because the general culture has changed for the better. Like I said, the general culture's values conflict with the static values of education. So I don't think you could set up that kind of school today. I don't know what to do about freeing the schools and universities, because there isn't like a cadre of, I call them liberal, genuinely liberal teachers who could go in to replace them. It's not like the civil service where you could just overnight reform it by the Prime Minister just declaring that he's reforming it. But you can't do that with schools. So I don't know. It has to be gradual.
In a way, they're the most stuck in frozen institutions. I got a tour of the Oxford colleges recently, some of them, and it was all about tradition. This is exactly the way it was 300 years ago. This is exactly the way it was 150 years ago. And it was interesting to see a mix of such tradition along with, it's supposed to be so much new creativity in education.
They've kept exactly the wrong things, and they've changed things to exactly the wrong things. So they still have enacting rituals, but enacting rituals isn't our culture.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they've got all sorts of subjects that didn't exist then because they're useless. And existing subjects, useful subjects, are being taken over. Richard Dawkins almost got cancelled the previous time when he went to New Zealand, and they said that they're incorporating traditional modes of understanding physics. And he was like, no, there is only one mode of understanding physics. And they were like, that's racist.
We already have that in Australia. The syllabus is replete with Indigenous modes of doing science.
Well, this was a few years ago, so maybe it's done in New Zealand and Australia. This is terrible, and it's going to cause everything to deteriorate. I don't think it will cause the destruction of our culture. But once our culture is deteriorated enough, then the Chinese can walk in.
I look forward to the indigenous electric motor.
There's a famous case. There was a book written by this, what was his name? Dark Emu is the name of the book, where it's just a revisionist history that claims that prior to European settlement in Australia, the Indigenous people were farming, they had agriculture, they were on their way to factories and all this sort of stuff, and people just lap it up, and it is making its way into the curriculum now as well. Bruce Pascoe's his name. Yeah, he claims to be Indigenous, but he's not. That goes to our capacity to error correct. Misinformation is a fashionable term, but it's also labels a very genuine phenomenon. There was, I think it was only a few months ago, that Osama bin Laden's letter to America or whatever was going around being praised by certain college students who thought, not understanding that this was not a good guy.
Okay, so maybe the way to go, if we can't restore 1950s schools, how about restoring 1950s curricula? That's something that the government could do. The national curriculum, of course, is an abomination. But maybe it's one of those things that can be, as a transitional thing, have the national curriculum now, and it's full of woke stuff. It's in the government's power to change that, to make it into true stuff. The government could change the national curriculum, and then it may be that this woke stuff, I said it's a fad, it's not, how can I put this? It's not an evolved thing. It's not a blind alley that culture has gone down. It's a fad. So it could be that after a generation of teaching old-fashioned history teachers will think that's what it is, rather than, because it's the teachers and the pupils are getting the revisionist history at the moment. If they got another history, would they even notice? Maybe they wouldn't even notice. I don't know. Maybe that's too optimistic. But I get the feeling that it's all shallow. I think of lefties of the 20s and 30s. They believed stuff. They believed in the capitalist class stealing the fruits of the labor of the working class, and that this is why the working class are poor, and all that stuff. And the remedy is that they had a theory, whereas I don't think woke is a theory.
Denial of a whole bunch of otherwise good pieces of knowledge, whether it be science or Enlightenment ideas.
As I've often said, the negation of an explanation is not an explanation. So they don't have a rival worldview, except the worldview that you're supposed to say certain things, not say other things, and so on. But it's not a worldview in the sense that communism was.
I think it might be an evolution of communism. It's because there are a lot of communist ideas at the core of it.
Yeah.
And they tend to end up on the same side as the communists, a lot of outcomes.
Yeah, but do they have a theory that anything about factories, that factories...
They do have a theory that there are people keeping them down, that, for example, inflation is up because of price gouging.
Yeah.
That's their current theory.
So that's a theory that the left-wing people used to have. They used to have it because it came from their explanation of the world.
The finite resource explanation of the world. Which...
And more complicated things as well. But I think if you ask a woke demonstrator, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe you could try it. Ask them, how is inflation caused by the greed of the factory owners or whatever it is? Now, a communist in 1950 could have told you, but I don't think a woke person today can tell you. Like when they're asked from the river, they're chanting from the river to the sea, and somebody asks them which river and which sea, and they don't know.
I mean, but to your earlier point, these anti-rational memes don't have to be correct. They can drive species extinction, and the next species can figure out what was true and what wasn't.
Yeah. I don't think that's what I don't think they're going to. I don't think they're poison. I think they are a burden.
They could be poisonous in the sense that they drive certain voting blocks, and then those voting blocks drive policies of nations. So I think your homeland is facing exactly this issue, which is now, I think, something like 30% of the Muslims are in the West and they're voting. And so the traditional support for Israel is disappearing.
There are plenty of Muslims who are pro-Israel. The mindless ones are anti-Israel. Like I just tweeted today that, what's it called, Travel in Israel video blog was talking about the collaboration of the Palestinians with the Nazis during World War II. And he happened to mention, I think he should have made much more of this, that Grand Mufti was going around Europe recruiting Muslims to the Nazi cause. In Albania, it totally failed. In Albania, the absolute opposite. They were one of two countries that rescued almost all their Jews. One was Denmark, and they didn't have that many. There was only about 6,000 in the whole of Denmark, but they rescued almost all of them. But the Albanians, there were a lot of Jews there, and a lot of Italian and other Jews had moved to Albania as a refuge, and they were all saved because the Albanians as a population thought it was, even as their religion, they thought it was their duty to thwart the deportation of the Jews, and they succeeded. So this is, as I tweeted as well, this is a counterexample to the narrative that some otherwise cogent commentators, like you just did, assume. It's not necessarily the case. And it's also not necessarily the case. So we've had, in Britain, we've had Muslim immigrants, and then their children are radicalized. Not them, their children are radicalized. Whose fault is that? That's not the fault of Islam. That's the fault of Britain and multiculturalism and pandering to the other and so on, and setting up the educational system so that it trashes Britain and glorifies the other and so on. But it needn't have been. 100 years ago, there were hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the British Army. Another 50 years earlier, there also were, and they rebelled, but that's another story in the Indian Mutiny. But then so did the Hindus. So it wasn't Islam, it was the fault of the West. Not for treating them too harshly, in a way for treating them too leniently, for that they should have been integrated, and it should have been understood that the same law applies to them as to everyone else. I'm a second-generation immigrant, and I'm not violent. And my parents came to this country and took for granted that they were going to have to work. And they took for granted that they were going to have to learn English and speak it well and get a job and so on, and go to university. And they took for granted all those things. And the idea that they were owed something by the surrounding culture is quite the opposite, that we owe something to the surrounding culture. That was their attitude.
To what extent then is it an existential threat to the UK, given you have had these huge protests recently taking over parts of London, and I think you've had people under the auspices of the Green Party getting in and then coming out as vehemently anti-Semitic,
Yeah, note that those people aren't the only people who are being indulged in this way. Basically, it's everyone who hates our culture is being indulged, and everybody who is afraid of that is being demonized. The government can change that. I think the processes of criticism and persuasion are not impaired. The government isn't, like almost everything that Douglas Murray says about this issue is perfectly legal and is going to remain legal even under the most draconian laws that are currently being proposed, which by the way, may not succeed. There's a lot more to error correction in the British system than merely outvoting the government. There's going to be all sorts, because the government, one thing hasn't changed. The government, no matter how large its majority, knows that next week it could go down if suitable things happen. So the basic reason that the government is going down this wrong path is that most people think it's okay. Most people don't think this is a disaster. They're like, well, okay, we don't want riots, so let's have laws against riots. And people are arguing, but these aren't laws against riots. They're laws against hate or
speech,
so on. But that argument hasn't gone down with enough people, and when it does, it'll change. Oh yes, this is what David Starkey was saying. He was saying that the Red Wall, if you know what that is, that's
the Labour voting bloc.
Yeah, the Labour voting bloc in Northern England, which changed over to Boris Johnson en masse and changed back at this election. The Red Wall is never going to vote Labour again. Never, ever. because these measures are against it. The Labour Party has severed its connection with the working class. And they got in by a combination of circumstances, because the Conservative Party was rubbish, and the circumstances, the pandemic and all sorts of circumstances made people ready for a change. But they have gone down. Now, I don't think it's necessarily that they'll never vote Labour again, because there are people in the Labour Party who will be able to see what's happening long before the next election. And I'm sure that there are people in the Labour Party now who see that they can't go on like this. We'll see. Let's see if the current woke legislation actually goes through when the Labour Party has a majority of 100 and something. That's not enough for it to work. Let's see. And if it goes through, the next level of error correction is that it'll never be implemented. Like, the Home Office people will not order the police chiefs to spend the money to implement the surveillance system, which will be necessary to enforce the law. None of that will happen, because on the whole, nothing happens. That's one of the things that's wrong with the blob, with the civil service. It prevents everything from. To have that happening, the government would have to pursue it. They would have to pursue it vigorously and ruthlessly, firing the people who didn't implement it and that kind of thing. And only then, even then, when the first people go to jail for this kind of thing, there'll be an uproar. What are they going to do about it? Are they going to tell all the editors of the newspapers to say that this is improper and it should have happened? Yeah, at some point, the editors of the newspapers are not going to automatically follow this line either. There will be a niche for people to contradict it. I don't think anything's inevitable. And once that problem is solved, by the way, then the population problem will also be solved, because the obvious way of solving the population problem is by immigration. Mass immigration is the way to go. And we've only got to make sure that people who hate this country don't immigrate into it.
But how do you?
They'll be willing. This is something that people who have thought a lot about this will think a lot about it. At the moment, they've been thinking how to do the opposite. If you, for example, you can have a rule that everybody who is allowed into the country has to declare that for a start, they could have to declare that they love the country and want to do well in it. And then if it later turns out they were lying, they can be deported, not for being enemies of Britain, but for lying on the immigration form.